democracy, freedom. Those are the gifts. I talked about the flaws in our system. Those are the virtues in our system that our founders, coming out of the Enlightenment, planted, and Lincoln carries them forward. He gives us the 2.0 version of them.
So a few tangent questions about each of those. So one on democracy. People often bring up the United States is not a democracy; it's a republic. That it's representative. Is there some interesting tensions there in terminology, or is can you maybe kind of expand on the different versions of democracy? So the philosophy of democracy, but also the practical implementations of it.
Sure. The founders intended for us to be a democracy. This argument that they wanted us to be a republic instead of a democracy is one of these made-up myths. They believed that fundamentally what they were creating was a society, very few of which had existed before, a society where the government would be of the people, by the people, for the people. That's what they expected, right? That's what it meant. So the legitimacy of our government was not going to be that the person in charge was of royal blood. Mm-hmm. That's the way the Europeans did it. Or that the person in charge had killed enough people, a la Genghis Khan, or that the person in charge was serving a particular class. It was that the person in charge, the institutions were to serve the people. They adopted Republican tools to get there because they were fearful, appropriately, of simply throwing every issue up to the masses. Mm-hmm. Democracy is not mob rule. Democracy is where you create procedures to assess the public will and to act in ways that serve the public without harming other elements of the public that are not in the majority. That's why we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. And for their time, the founders did not believe that women should be part of this discussion, that they were not capable. They were wrong about that. In their time, that's how they thought. We've, of course, changed that. They believed you had to have property to have a stake. We don't believe that anymore. So we can argue over the details, and those 50 years from now will criticize us, right, for the way we think about these things. But it was fundamentally about, this is the radicalism of the American experiment, that government should serve the people, all people.
So democracy means of the people, by the people, for the people, and then it doesn't actually give any details of how you implement that, because you could implement all kinds of ways.
Well, and I think what we've learned as historians, and I think what the founders knew, because they were very well read in the history of Rome and Greece, was that democracy will always have unique characteristics for the culture that it's in. If coming out of the war against Russia, Ukraine is able to build a better democracy than it had before, it's never going to look like the United States. I'm not saying it's going to be worse or better. Culture matters. The particular history of societies matters. Japan is a vibrant democracy. I've been there many times. It does not look at all like the American democracy. So democracy is a set of values. The implementation of those values is a set of practical institutional decisions one makes based in one's cultural position.
So just to linger on that topic, is there, if you do representative, you said democracy should not, one failure mode is mob rule. So it should not descend into that. Not every issue should be up to everybody.
Correct.
Okay, so you have representation, but, Stalin similarly felt that he could represent the interests of the public. He was also helping represent the interests of the public. So that's a failure mode too. If the people representing the public become more and more powerful, they start becoming detached from actually being able to represent or having just a basic human sense of what the public wants.
I think being of the people, by the people, for the people means you are in some way accountable to the people. And the problem with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, this was already evident before Stalin came into power, is the same problem the Communist Party of China has today, which is that you have leadership that's non-accountable.
Well, let me go then to one of the other three principles of freedom, because one of the ways to keep government accountable is the freedom of the press. So there's the internet, and on the internet there's social networks, and one of them is called Twitter. I think you have an account there. People should follow you. And, recently people have been throwing around for a while, the words of freedom of speech. Just out of curiosity, for tangent upon a tangent, what do you think of freedom of speech as it is today and as it was at that time during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and throughout the history of America?
So freedom of speech has always been one of the core tenets of American democracy. And I'm near absolutist on it because I think that people should have the right to speak. What makes our democracy function is that there is always room for, quite frankly, people like you and me who like to disagree and have reasons to disagree. So I am against almost all forms of censorship. The only time I believe in censorship is if somehow an individual or a newspaper has stolen the Ukrainian plans for their next military movements in the next week. Yeah. You should not be able to publish that right now, maybe after they act. But criticism, opinion, interpretation should be wide open. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you have the right to come to my classroom and start shouting and saying whatever you want.
Yeah.
You have the right on the street corner to do that. But my classroom is a classroom for my students with a particular purpose.
Sorry about that from last week. I'll never do it again. I apologize. I'm really sorry.
It's okay.
Never happened.
You know,
I get drunk and I get. So the people who don't know, your professor UT Austin it's nearby. So sometimes I get a little drunk and wander in there. I apologize.
You're not the only one. Was that you? I didn't even know it was you.
I'm sorry. Okay.
So the point is that free speech is not licensed to invade someone else's space, and I also believe in private enterprise. So I think that if I owned a social media network, I don't. It would be up to me to decide who gets to speak on that network and who doesn't, and then people could decide not to use it if they don't want to use it.
But there's so yes, that's one of the founding principles. So oftentimes when you talk about censorship, that's government censorship. So social media, if you run a social media company, you should be able to decide from a technical perspective of what freedom of speech means. But there's some deeper ethical, philosophical sense of how do you create a world where every voice is heard, of the people, by the people, for the people. That's a complicated technical problem. When you have a public square, how do you have a productive conversation where critics aren't silenced, but at the same time, whoever has the bigger megaphone is not going to crowd out everybody else?
So I think it's very important to create rules of the game that give everyone a chance to get started, and that allow for guideposts to be created from the will of the community, which is to say that we as a community can say, we can't stop people from speaking, but we as a community can say that in certain forms, we're going to create certain rules for who gets to speak and who doesn't, under what terms, but they can still have somewhere else to go. So I believe in opening space for everyone, but creating certain spaces within those spaces that are designed for certain purposes. That's what a school does. Mm-hmm. So I will not bring someone to speak to my students who is unqualified. It's not a political judgment. The rules at a university are, we're an educational institution, you need to have the educational credentials to come speak about artificial intelligence. I'm not going to bring some bum off the street to do that, right? We have certain rules, but that bum on the street can still, in his own space or her own space, can still say what he or she wants to say about artificial intelligence. This is how newspapers work. When I write for the New York Times, they have an editorial team. The editorial team makes certain decisions. They check facts. And there's certain points of view. They don't allow anti-Semitic comments. Right? You're not going to be able to publish an anti-Semitic screed, whether you think it's true or not true, in the New York Times, but that doesn't prevent you from finding somewhere else. So we allow entities to create certain rules of the game. We make transparent what those rules are. And then we as citizens know where to go to get our information. What's been a problem the last few decades, I think, is it hasn't been clear what the rules are in different places and what are the legitimate places to get information and what are not.
Yeah, the transparency seems to be very critical there. Even for the New York Times, I think there's a lot of skepticism about which way the editorial processes lean. I mean, there's a public perception that it's, especially for opinions, it's going to be very left-leaning in the New York Times. And without transparency about what the process is like, about the people involved, all you do, like conspiracy theories and the general public opinion about that is going to go wild. And I think that's okay for the New York Times. People can, in a collective way, figure stuff out. Like they could say, okay, New York Times, 73% of the time is going to lean left. In their head, they have like a loose estimation or whatever. But for a platform like Twitter, it seems like they're it's more complicated. Now, of course, there should be rules of the game, but I think there's